Chapter 9. John of the Antarctic. One January night in 1972, I lay languidly draped over the comfortable deep red Chesterfield. I listened to the tiny clangs as bubbles of carbon dioxide effervesced their way past my ear to burst at the top of a quadruple glass of gin and slimline tonic with ice but no lemon in. I relaxed in the sheer lack of austerity in this, the largest room in my penthouse in Belsize Park. Banks of spotlights focused harsh geometric slabs of magenta, emerald green and beige across the walls, while from a thurible effused frangipani, bergamot and chypre, compounding a mirantic furor of didantilism. From some 43 feet away I could barely make out the distant drone of my brother, who is, after all, a surgeon, examining a friend of mine. This friend had an umbilical hernia I thought needed attention. His examination complete, my brother agreed, and we set about making the arrangement for his admission to hospital, when the telephone rang and a voice said, "Is that Dr. Graham Chapman?" "Yes," I riposted. "Ah," said the voice, "you're just down as Chapman, Dr. G in the book. I just wanted to check. I've got a young man staying with me who's quite ill. He's got a high fever, but he refuses to go to hospital or see my doctor. He says that he's met you. You gave him your autograph once. He says he would see you." "Who is that?" You wouldn't know if I told you, but it's Richard Milner." "You were right," I told the voice, "and that the best thing would be to wrap him up well and bring him round, as we seem to be holding a mini-surgery in my flat that evening anyway." Half an hour later he arrived, a good-looking young man, introducing himself as John Tomichek. I'd seen him outside a Kensington restaurant. The long dark hair, olive complexion, bright blue fur-lined jacket, and blue and maroon trousers jogged the memory. I showed him into the main room and took a brief history. He was 17 years old, from Liverpool, and in London, staying with a friend, while waiting to take up some sort of apprenticeship with a shoe firm. He had had 2 similar attacks of fever at roughly monthly intervals, but this was the worst yet. He also complained of tiredness, general muscle pains, and headache. My brother examined him, and finding enlargement of the superficial lymph nodes, considered glandular fever, or infectious mononucleosis if you would prefer, though why you should I don't know, the most likely diagnosis. The fever at monthly intervals sounded more ominous, however, reminiscent of a Pell-Ebstein fever found in the more serious condition of Hodgkin's disease, a lymphadenoma if you'd prefer that. We decided immediate hospitalization would be wise, and with the aid of his efficaciousness A.R. Bailey physician, had him admitted to the Royal Northern Hospital for bed rest and the appropriate clinical tests. The tests confirmed the diagnosis of glandular fever and showed that he'd had a fairly severe infection which had affected his liver. 2 weeks later, the ambulance service rang me to say, "We've got a John Robert Tomichek here who's only given us your address. Since you had him admitted, where should we take him?" They actually sounded busier than that. "Bring him here," I said, thinking, well, we can sort everything out between ourselves. John arrived, and certainly looked better, though still pale and weak. He was rather non-committal about this friend he'd been staying with, Richard Milner. I thought that rather than have him going off, popping into pubs, doing further damage to his liver, perhaps a short convalescence with us would be wise. We did have a spare room. I asked him about his family and background, but because of his strong Liverpool accent and an ability to feel less well whenever he was questioned, I let things ride, thinking, well, he'll tell us when he's ready. Meantime, we shall make sure he eats well and continues to recover. This proved difficult, and he only ate fish and chips and jam butties, but 4 weeks later he had indeed recovered. I'd just finished an intense writing stint and thought that a weekend away would be a good idea, and so it was that David, Andrew, my Irish-Portuguese chauffeur, John and I set off to go to North Wales. I'd equipped all of them with climbing boots, anoraks, etc., and at last had a team who would come climbing with me. It was an uneventful journey, apart from a major accident when a 25-ton truck drove into the side of my Vandenplas Princess at 50 miles an hour. Fortunately, the car bore the blow pretty well, and we were able to continue our journey. There were 2 doors on the other side of the car, after all. Rather later than I'd hoped that night, we checked into the Penigwrydd Hotel at the foot of Mount Snowdon. It was February, and Snowdon can be a difficult proposition in the winter, but we were well equipped: ice axes, ropes, carabiners, space blankets, emergency rations, the lot. The next morning, when we set out from the Penny Pass, there were patches of blue in the sky and the air was crisp. Up above us, Crib Goch, the first peak in the Snowdon group we were about to climb, stood covered in cloud down to just about the snow line. We would have at least 1,000 feet of snow and ice to tackle before reaching its summit. From Crib Goch, I was hoping to complete half the Snowdon horseshoe by going on to the top of the highest peak and then to make our return to base coming down via the easy pig track. I think John was a little alarmed at the number of people he saw coming down, having failed to get up. I was slightly apprehensive myself, but confident that there was nothing 4 young fit men couldn't take on. At one point there was a tricky little slab of rock covered with ice, which in the cloud gave the appearance of being steeper than it actually was. John was worried by this at first, but I lowered a rope to him to make sure that he got up safely. We very rarely needed to cut steps and made good time up to the summit itself. The ridge extending from Crib Goch to the main body of Snowdon is a narrow one, and in these conditions represented a knife edge of rock covered with ice. Steep snow slopes fell precipitously on either side, disappearing into the cloud below. It was appallingly cold, way below zero, and the wind tore at us, showering us with spicules of ice. Suddenly, everything went crimson, with little gussets of gamboge, but Evans knew what Scott was thinking. That Ballyman Oates has been a pain in the neck ever since we hit Antarctica 9 months ago. The frost over Evans' eyebrows and icicles in his beard can't hide the fact, thought Scott, that Evans' lips, though green with cold, would, if they could, have said what he knew him to be thinking. Oates was a bore, an unmitigated, crushing bore. Whatever possessed them to accept such a fellow in the first place? Well, he's nipped out for a moment for one of his boring little walks. He'll be back in a minute, screaming odes at us at the top of his voice over the howl of the wind. The 2 men stared at each other, then, acting like 2 men, crawled out and dismantled the tent, ran off, and piled it onto the back of the sledge. The sledge, covered with the bodies of the dead dogs whom they later intended to give a decent English burial, was heavy, but the thought of Oates quoting "a thing of beauty is a" made them pull even harder, and they broke into a jog as the thought of Oates' premature return struck them both. Soon they were miles away, safely encamped again, making up stories about how brave Oates had been, walking out like that, saying, "I'm just going out for a walk," though really we both knew how he considered himself as a burden on us. Tee-hee-hee, they both thought, until they didn't. Almost as suddenly everything went white, and we were progressing along the ridge, for safety in the high wind, quite often sitting astride it, with one leg hanging either side. We were getting along slowly, but safely, and I was thankful for the cloud. If any of the party had seen the drop on either side, they might have been as worried as I was. We came to the end of the first part of the ridge, and the going became easier, but I thought we'd better abandon our original plan and get down sooner. I was thinking of safety and the pub opening hours. I decided to take a more direct route down a gully to our left. To make a quicker descent, I unroped the whole team for the climb down the snow slope. John, thinking, what a relief, it's all over, we're down the dangerous bit, leapt off ahead. I stopped him, and we all roped up again. I knew that steady progress was better than haste, because at the bottom of these couloirs, what in summer is a waterfall, in winter becomes a miniature glacier. Sure enough, when we got to the point where the waterfall should have been, there was an ice flow. I had to cut steps down it carefully. It took about an hour and a half to get down the ice slope, but as soon as we were at the bottom of it, we were almost on the snow line, scattered patches of snow and rocks above a scree. On easier ground again, we unroped. We could actually see the pig track 300 feet or so below us. John again set off rather too quickly, and I shouted at him to slow down. Unfortunately, he had picked up so much momentum he couldn't stop, tripped and somersaulted about 35 feet down the mountainside. In the process, he cut his forehead and collected some chest abrasions and a possible fractured left leg. We climbed down to him and tried to carry him, but the pain from the leg was soon too much for him to bear. I stayed with him, wrapped him in space blankets and patched up his forehead with surgical tape, sending David and Andrew down with our map reference to get the mountain rescue team.